life is a mess and you're totally stressed out, just call Trent. Just call Trent. When your wife is cold as ice and you need some advice, just call Trent. Just call Trent. He'll shoot it straight and he won't say no. He'll just give you that advice and say, well, there you go.
Hello and welcome to another episode of There You Go with Trent Mabry. I, of course, am your host, Trent Mabry. Today, my guest is Brian Kiley. Brian was a longtime writer for Conan. He currently writes for the Ellen DeGeneres Show. He's also written 2 novels, and he's a great stand-up comic. We talk about starting out in Boston, getting the writing job at Conan, and what it's like writing for a late-night show and a daytime show, all that and much more. So here it is, my interview with Brian Kiley. So where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston.
Okay. And any brothers or sisters?
I'm the middle of 5 kids. So I have an older sister, older brother, younger brother.
Oh, the big fan.
Set.
Yeah. Were you always like a fan of comedy when you were younger? Were you like a comedy nerd or?
I was, yeah, a huge comedy nerd. And yeah, and I would read joke books as a kid. And I just remember, I just loved sitcoms and I loved listening to comedy albums. And yeah, I loved Mad Magazine. And my brother and I had our own little Mad Magazine.
Oh, really?
Knockoff that we would write. And yeah. Yeah, a huge comedy nerd.
Who are some of your favorite comics?
At the time when I was a kid?
Yeah.
Well, I loved Rodney Dangerfield, even though it's just funny where I wasn't relating to his jokes because I was a kid, but still, his jokes were great. I loved Woody Allen, although you're not supposed to say that now, I guess.
His stand-up is great, though.
It's so amazing.
Yeah.
I loved Bob Newhart. I liked Bill Cosby. I don't know what to tell you. It's a dangerous world we live
right.
in. You really can't have any heroes anymore. But, I always get in trouble with these things because when people ask me this question, I did like Carol Burnett, but there were so few female comics when I was a little kid. So they're like, oh, no, it's like, Joan Rivers was on too late. She'd be on Johnny Carson, which was too late for me. And when I finally did get to see her, I didn't know half the people she was talking about because I was a kid, what I mean?
Right.
So I didn't really know who Elizabeth Taylor was or Willie Nelson or whoever she was making fun of, So, yes, so it was mostly, by and large, it was a group of men that I was fans of, But when I was a kid, even, like if I was playing outside or something and a comedian was coming on, Mike Douglas or Merv Griffin, which these afternoon talk shows, she would call me, Brian, there's a comedian on, and I would come in and she didn't do that with my other siblings. She just knew that I loved comedy. And yeah, I wanted to, if there's a comedian on, I couldn't stay up late and watch Johnny Carson. So if there's a comedian on TV, I wanted to see him. Yeah,
I was the same way. So when did you always realize like that's what you wanted to do?
Well, I didn't, when I was a kid, it shows you how old I am, but I had never heard of comedy clubs, and they weren't really a thing and I think even, I remember when I didn't hear about the Comedy Store until I was like 18 or something. And I was like, what's this, but, so I didn't know how to be a comedian. I didn't know how people became them, but I did know, I used to watch the Dick Van Dyke Show, and he was a comedy writer. He wrote on a TV show. So I was like, hey, these shows have writers. So I wanted to be a comedy writer. I was like, I don't know how to be a comedian, but I know people are comedy writers, so people do that. So I from a young age, I aspired to do that.
Yeah. And then, so you go off to college, you go to Boston College, right? And that's where you started doing stand-up?
Yeah. So what happened was there was a comedy show at my school, and the guy headlining was this guy named Barry Crimmins, who I thought was hilarious. And I went and met with him. I met him after the show and said, I'd love to be a comedy writer, and I've written all these. So I'd been writing jokes since I was, a teenager, but 13 or something. So I had all these jokes saved. So I was like, hey, I wrote these jokes, and he was running a club in Cambridge, Mass, called the Ding Ho. So we met for a cup of coffee, and I brought my jokes, and he kind of critiqued them or whatever. And he was saying, in Boston, you really can't make any money writing for people. You have to perform. And I was like, oh, it was too terrifying. But then that summer I took a comedy class at Emerson for summer school, taught by Dennis Leary. And in the class we wrote scripts, but we also did stand-up. And the final class, they had like a little show, and there was a professional comic there named Andrea Michaels who said, you really should pursue this. So I went to the open mic, and coincidentally, my friend Barry Crimmins was the host. And I had my first show, and it went great. And then, I went back the next week and bombed, and I kind of bombed every other show for a while there. But I started doing it when I was in college. And then my senior year, I would get some paid gigs, which I would get, $20 or $30, whatever. $50 was a big one. And then I started doing it full time after I graduated, and then and then I've been a comic ever since.
So were you working the road when you
I
first
was,
started?
but I was kind of fortunate because the comedy boom kind of happened right at that time. So a lot of clubs opened up, and what would happen is not only were comedy clubs opening up, like a restaurant would have a comedy night one night a week, or a bar would have a comedy night one night a week, and working the Boston comedy scene, there were so many great headliners there that had a really thriving scene. So, you might be in Maine one night doing an Elks Club, and then the next night you're at a college in Vermont, and then the next night you're at a bar in Rhode Island or whatever. So there was a ton of work.
And it was all like relatively close.
Yes. So I did go the road. After a while, I did start going on the road, say once a month. I'd go for a week. I'd go to Syracuse, or I would go to Indianapolis for a couple of weeks. They had a thing where they'd book you for 2 weeks. You'd be 1 week downtown and 1 week in Broad Ripple.
Oh, is that at Crackers?
It was at the time was the Comedy Connection.
Oh,
but
okay.
There was a Crackers there, but I happened to work for the Comedy Connection.
Okay.
And but with the New England scene, they had so many shows, they had this demand. So I was able to do, a half an hour virtually every night, 5 or 6 nights a week. So I was just getting a ton of stage time, and in a variety of circumstances. So it really just helped. All that stage time just really helps,
Right. And so who were the guys that were around in Boston? You mentioned, was Dennis Leary, he was around, or was he?
He was, but he really wasn't one of the headliners then. They had, it was Kenny Rogerson and Stephen Wright, Lenny Clark, Steve Sweeney, Don Gavin, Mike McDonald, Mike Donovan, Barry Crimmins, DJ Hazard, Jimmy Tingle. I'm gonna miss people,
right?
And also, it was, once again, I apologize, almost all men.
Right. Yeah.
Paula Poundstone was there, but she left the scene pretty early. She left kind of before I started and moved to San Francisco. So she would come back here and there, but there were no female headliners. Lauren Dombrowski came on the scene and was very funny. But I don't think she headlined too often. It was just these guys are really strong acts, and they were very unique. Each one was very unique.
Right.
But it was, I hate to say it, an almost all white male scene.
Yeah. So when did you move to New York?
Well, the things actually began to change. What happened was they opened a Catch a Rising Star in Cambridge.
Okay.
And that actually had a lot of diversity. And there were, so the group that I was kind of my class, so to speak, would be like Dana Gould and Laura Keitlinger, Janine Garofalo, David Cross, Mark Maron, Louis C.K., Tom Agnes, so Wendy Liebman. So that group, the Cambridge scene was a lot more diverse, and at least in terms of there were a lot more women.
Right.
There really weren't that many. There was still not a lot of people of color, but and so I worked there a lot. And then I didn't move to New York until after I was working at Conan.
Oh, really? So you stayed in Boston while you were working on Conan?
I did. You know, my wife was a VP of a company, and when I got hired at Conan, I had these 13-week contracts, and the show was very shaky then. There were constant rumors about the show being canceled. So the idea of my wife quitting her job and us moving to New York and then the show being canceled was kind of, so they would let me work from home 1 or 2 days a week, and I would go back and forth.
Okay.
And then eventually my wife did quit her job, and we moved to New York, and we were there for a bunch of years. Yeah.
So how'd the job at Conan come about? You submitted a packet, or?
Well, what happened was somebody had gotten fired, and they were looking for somebody to write his monologue. And at the time, I'd been writing a lot of topical jokes on my act every day. So, and if I headlined, which was occasional, I would, if I did 45 minutes, probably half of it was topical stuff. So I was getting used, it was pre-internet, I'm a million years old, but it was that thing of getting the newspaper, going through the newspaper and writing jokes every day, and then doing them on stage that night. So I did that. So when they asked me to submit jokes, I was kind of in the habit of doing that. And when they asked me to submit a packet, I just typed up 50 jokes. So I would probably say 35 of them I'd been doing in my act for the last month or two, and then say 15 new ones or so.
Okay. And then you got hired from that.
Yeah, then they called me, and I was friends with Tom Agna and Chuck Sklar and Louis C.K. who were working there. So they were kind of encouraging me. And then they called and said, okay, you start tomorrow. So I just
and that was like, the show was fairly new when you got hired.
Yeah, it was six months old.
6 months. And were you watching the show before you got hired? Did you feel like you knew the voice, or?
I didn't I didn't watch it that much until I was about to get hired. I mean, I guess probably when I knew there's a possibility of getting hired, I started watching it. But part of the thing was, I was out in clubs every night, and I was in these different places, and sometimes I was on the road and whatever. So I often wasn't home when the show was on.
Yeah. So when you're doing topical jokes in your stand-up, how long would you do a topical joke?
Well, that's a good point. It kind of depends on the joke. Like if you wrote a joke about Clinton and he was the president, you could do that pretty much during his presidency.
Right.
But some jokes have a shorter shelf life than others. You'd write about the Olympics, say, and then there was the Tanya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan thing, so that had legs for a couple of months. But and then if there's an obscure story that you had a joke about, you could do that for a couple of years because nobody knew when that happened anyway. You know what I mean? But there were some that just sometimes you would just do that one time, and some maybe for a couple of days. But yeah, depending on the story, some things would moved on and people would be like, what's that? They don't even remember whatever. So yeah, it depends on the joke. But the the tough part about topical jokes is that they have such a short shelf life.
Mm-hmm.
The good part is you can write a lot of them and churn it over.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's easier to sit down and write 15 topical jokes than 15 jokes about stuff in your act, because the stuff in your life doesn't change that much day to day.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the news, there's new things happening all the time.
Right. So when you got hired at Conan, that was your first writing job, obviously.
Yeah.
Did you find it was an easy transition from writing stand-up to working on the show?
It was pretty easy for me. Conan and I had a lot in common in terms of we were two sort of repressed Irish Catholic guys, So there were jokes that people would write that he would feel uncomfortable with, and I'd be like, yeah, I'd feel uncomfortable saying that too, or whatever. So it really didn't take me. I felt like I got jokes on from right away, but I did have to make adjustments. Like I would write some wordplay jokes, which I thought were clever and clean and whatever, and he hated them. So he kind of beat those out of me, and I stopped writing them, and I even stopped writing them from my act. What things that I thought were clever, he thought were corny, and it was like, oh, okay. So I had to make that adjustment. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, I was able to get jokes on right away, and some of it's, you give him so many that after a while you kind of figure out he likes this kind of joke and not that kind of joke. But I would give him 35 or 40 every day, so he had some stuff to choose from.
So you're writing like that 35 or 40 jokes a day, and you're mainly writing monologue jokes. You're not writing sketches.
At that time, they did do what they call desk pieces in those days, where they do that big call year 2000s.
Yeah.
And they did some desk pieces. So I would help out with that stuff. I probably wrote a sketch like once a year, but I would write jokes for the jokey pieces,
right,
along with the monologue. Yeah.
And then you're still doing stand-up.
I'm still doing stand-up in it. Yeah.
Right. Like during the show, you're still going out and doing stand-up at night.
I'm still going out. And what they would do is they would put me on the show when somebody would cancel. So only once did they ever give me a date and say, okay, you're on, May 2nd. The rest of the time would be like, so tomorrow, what are you doing? Really, because somebody would cancel at the last minute and they needed so I was always working on my next set, and I kept a suit in my office, and I had to be ready for the next time that it happened.
Well, the good thing about your act is you're all one-liners.
Yeah.
So it's not easy, but it's easier than like doing a long bit, like to do a 5-minute set.
When you do one-liners, it's perfect for a 5-minute TV spot. The hard part is when you're headlining or you're doing it, you're supposed to do an hour.
Yeah.
That's 180 jokes or whatever. It's like, that's a lot.
Just memorize.
Listen to. And to memorize and have 180 good ones and all that stuff, But a 5-minute, because, there are guys who are great storytellers, and you watch them for an hour, it's very enjoyable, but it might take them 2 minutes to get to their first punchline.
Right.
That's in terms of TV, that's just too long.
Exactly. Yeah. So now you did the Tonight Show with Jay Leno. Was that was before Conan, right?
Yes, I did that a couple times before Conan. Yeah.
And what was that process like of getting on the show?
Well, I had it's a little hard to remember now, but to some extent, but I had auditioned for Jimmy Brogan, and I had sent him. I guess I had done Evening at the Improv or Comedy on the Road or one of those shows, and I'd sent him the tape, and he thought it was pretty good. And then, but enough to take a look at me again. So when I went out to LA, I auditioned for him, and it really went great. And he said he got about 3/4 of a set there. So I was like, okay. So I went back home, and I probably had 17 jokes and he wanted 24. That's like he cut out some he didn't like. So I needed about 7 or 8 more or something like that. So I went home and wrote new jokes and then I sent him a new tape. And I came home one day and there was a message on my answering machine saying, yeah, it's Jimmy Brogan from Tonight Show. Let's book a spot. And I was like, I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah.
And I had to play it over a few times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. But Jimmy Brogan, who's a great comic.
He was also like, I think the head monologue writer for Leno.
He was, and he writes squeaky clean. Like, and he's even squeaky, like he doesn't even swear off stage. It's like, so he he really wanted a squeaky clean set. And so that's what I gave him. And I was able to fly out there and do it. And it was so exciting.
Right. And then you did that, and then you're writing on Conan, and then you get Letterman while you're a writer for Conan.
Yeah. So what happened was, with the Tonight Show, I did it twice before I got Conan. And then there was a new booker. And luckily he named David Lee, and he liked me, and he put me on a couple of times. And then when he left, there was a new booker again, and the new bookers didn't care for me. And you're kind of like, oh, and I don't know if, this happens sometimes in clubs where you work a club for years and then someone who's booking it and they don't know who you are and whatever.
Right.
You're like, I've been working there for 10 years or whatever. Yeah. So I was crushed when they weren't interested. And I had auditioned for Letterman. The first time I auditioned for Letterman, I was 25. And the producer came up to me and told me I was very good. And then I didn't hear from them. And then I auditioned for them a couple other times and never heard from them. And then one day at Conan, they called me out of the blue and said, hey, can you do the show today? And what happened was Dave got sick. Dave had shingles. So Bruce Willis was supposed to be the first guest, and they had him be the host instead.
Okay.
So they needed an extra guest. And I don't know how many other comics they called before me. But, from the time the producer told me that I was very good when I was 25 to the time I got on the show, it was 17 years later. And I didn't even know that I was being considered,
Right.
So I had my suit in my office, and I just went over. And I said, the Conan let me go. And I went over there at, 4 p.m. And I just kind of said, okay, just do your best stuff. And, and so that, and then after that, they would call me when they needed someone at the last minute.
Yeah.
People don't like to see me planned. They rather just.
Right. Yeah. Spur of the moment. So it wasn't until, so I was able to do it a few more times. And once again, somebody had canceled and they needed, and then it wasn't until I moved to LA that they actually had to give me a spot and be like, all right, we have to give you a date and do that. Right. So, but yeah, so I was lucky enough to be able to do that until Dave went off the air. So you did all the big shows. Was the one more nerve-wracking than the other, or were they all about the same?
I think that the first time doing the Tonight Show was so exciting but terrifying. It was nerve-wracking doing. It was Letterman because I was so in awe of Letterman.
Right. Yeah.
And I remember one time I was doing, when I'd done it 4 or 5 times. Once that I had one joke that had no way of getting into the other. I just had a very incredibly lame transition that I was aware of, but I didn't. Normally in my act, I had these other things that would go in between, but I had already done them on the show or whatever. So I just remember one time I'm doing the show and I had an incredibly lame transition, and I just hear Dave laughing like sort of a mocking laugh, like what was it? Like I'm sure and I wanted to turn and go, I'm sorry, I had no way to get from this joke to that joke. But I was kind of laughing in my head, like the crowd wasn't really know what was going on, but he was as a comic, he's like, wait, that was your transition? You
Yeah.
know? But I would always have, whenever I did the Tonight Show or whenever I did Conan, I would have this moment of terror. And it might be the night before. I might wake up 4 a.m. like, oh my God, I'm going to bomb. Or it might be, they'll have a car for you to take you over there or whatever. It might be in the car on the way over of, oh my God, why did I agree to this? This stuff is not going to work. I'm going to bomb. What am I doing? And there would always be that, period of a few minutes of abject terror. And what I just eventually learned was that's just one of the steps in the thing. It's almost like it's like the 5 stages of death. You go, okay, at some point I'm going to be depressed or whatever. At some point I'm going to be completely terrified, and then that'll pass. And then I'll go and do the show, whatever.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned moving to California this was obviously to write for the Tonight Show, and Conan got it. Did you have any qualms about moving from New York to California?
Well, at that point, Dave's people had offered me a job there. And my son wanted me to take it and stay in New York. But two things, I felt a loyalty to Conan, and that I felt like I was friends, I'm friends with Conan, and
right.
That would, but also from a practical standpoint, I thought, well, Dave's probably going to retire in a couple of years, and Conan's going to keep going. So it just didn't make sense. As flattered as I was, and as much as I would have liked to work for Dave, it didn't seem to make sense for me. And then Conan, of course, did have a longer run,
Right.
Although not with the Tonight Show, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's when was the Tonight Show, was the practice different? Was it different from the late night show?
Yes, because the Tonight Show had this history of having a long monologue. Johnny had done a long monologue. Jay did a very long monologue. So Conan felt like it was incumbent on him to have a long monologue. So we hired a couple more writers, and he would do about 15 jokes. When I first started Conan, he would do 4 jokes. And then we kind of got it up to maybe 7 or 8. But now we're suddenly doing twice as many. And there were never enough jokes. No matter, you just, and now I'm writing 60 or 70 jokes, and I had a knot in my stomach the whole time. The pressure was terrible. And I thought, well, eventually it will dissipate after we've been here a while. No, we weren't there long enough for it to ever go away. But, one day I got 7 jokes on, which was huge for me. The best I ever had, still not enough. We still needed more.
Yeah.
And it was just that it was really a pressure cooker, and it was really not fun. And also, when you're writing that many, you're not spending time really crafting any and trying to get the wording just right and making it the twist clever and so on. You're just writing first drafts and handing them out. And some jokes need a little finessing,
Right. Yeah, I was gonna ask, out of those 50, 60 jokes, how many usually would you get on, or how many would you feel like were good jokes?
I would probably get on 4 or so. 2 were probably pretty good. I mean, 2 were, and then 2 were kind of okay, or formula jokes or something, but it's only once a week do you write a joke that you just absolutely love.
Right.
The rest of the time you're like, yeah, this will work, or this is pretty funny, or that's a good joke. But in terms of the ones that you absolutely love, it's probably once a week that you know. And to Conan's credit, invariably he'd pick the one that I loved the most. So I felt like he and I was simpatico in that regard. And, you know, and also I got to a point, there's certain jokes I'd write and I'd think he's going to pick that one.
Yeah, you
know,
can tell.
Just knowing. And there was one time when we were in New York, Brian Stack, one of the writers, brilliant guy, he came in and it was ironic. It was Martin Luther King Day. And he said his 5-year-old said to him, he was a doctor and a king.
That's funny.
Which we laughed at. And I said, you might want to check tonight's monologue. And then we did it as George W. Bush said, it's Martin Luther King Day. And then so it's from a 5-year-old kid saying it, we turned it into the president saying it.
Right. Yeah. That's funny. So as you're writing for the show, you're still writing stand-up. Did you feel like that affected your stand-up or?
Well, it's funny because once I got my job at Conan, I stopped writing any topical stuff for my act because I never had that thing of like, oh, do I keep this for me and give this to him or whatever?
Right.
So I would only write jokes about my personal, then I had kids and write about them being babies and then being, a little older and all that kind of stuff. So, then my act has remained just about my life and no longer stuff in the news or whatever.
So when the Tonight Show ends, were you just what were you thinking of? Because I know Conan, like, fairly recently after it ended, he went on to do the TBS show, but how do you feel those few months?
Yeah, we ended abruptly in January, and then I think the new show began in November, if I'm not mistaken. So I think we started in September, but we had a few months there of being out of work and whatever, and that was very stressful. We moved across the country and bought a new house, and we had put our kids were in public school in New York, but then we put them in private school in LA. So it's suddenly like, oh boy,
yeah,
I'm suddenly out of work. I'm suddenly, what am I going to, all that stuff. So yes, that was quite stressful. And, I certainly thought Conan was going to get a new show. But never was show business,
right?
So that was a stressful time.
But then you wrote a book during that time, right?
I did. What happened was I was taking this writing class, and I wrote what I thought was a short story. And the teacher's like, well, that's not a short story. That's the first chapter of a novel. And I was like, it is? And, I was an English major and I do love to read and whatever. So the next week I'd bring the next chapter and so on. And I didn't know where the story was going. I didn't know what was, I didn't know what I was doing. But the class, each week they wanted to know what was going to happen next and all that kind of thing, and they were very encouraging. And now, because I was suddenly out of work, I didn't want to just sit around all day in sweatpants, unshaven, and watching Oprah or whatever. I was like, you know what? So every morning I'd get up and I would shower and shave, and I would go in. We have my guest room, and I would just I wouldn't bring my computer because I didn't want to be, you can easily just be on the internet all day and not get anything done. So I would just write with longhand.
Oh, really?
I would, and I would go in and I would write a chapter, or I'd write for a few hours. And, with my act, my dream was always to be on the Johnny Carson show. So I always tried to write clean. I tried to write TV clean. Every joke I'd write, I'd be like, okay, can I do this on TV or not? And I'd try to make sure I word it so I could do it on TV. And with this, I just let it go, and it's so dirty and dark and whatever. And at the end of the, at the end of the day, when I'd leave the room and I'd look at what I wrote, and I'd be like, oh, where'd that come from? It was,
Yeah.
but it was very liberating for me to actually be able to swear and have it be dirty and dark and kind of explore these things that are in me, but I was never allowed to express in a way,
Mhm.
So it was fun. It was very liberating to not sort of have the constraints of writing clean and writing jokes and have characters in a story and all that stuff was very freeing for me.
Right. And is that something you always envision yourself doing? You just never had the time, or?
Yes, I always like, and even my friend Crimmins would be like, when are you going to write your novel?
Mhm.
And I think just being an English major and loving to read, I think part of you thinks, maybe someday I'll do that or whatever, and not that I had a story in mind, but that was, and actually that really helped me sort of get through the being unemployed,
Mhm. Who are some of your favorite writers?
you know, I have to say I love Tolstoy.
Mhm.
There's in the story of the death of Ivan Ilyich. Ivan Ilyich is a guy he's got sort of a low-level job, and his kids are he's not close with them or his wife, and it's this kind of thing. And his greatest joy was playing cards with his friends and winning a little bit. Because if you won a lot, then there's bad feelings and it's unpleasant.
Mhm.
So, and I remember just thinking how genius that is. There's so many people I look at and I wonder, what's their greatest joy?
Mhm.
And some
Yeah.
people, their greatest joy is when their sports team wins, and you think, yeah, but you're not on the team,
Right.
And I love sports, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but I'm always, often when I meet people, that's something I think about of what's this person's greatest joy? And a lot of times if you have kids, things that they do is your greatest joy or whatever. But there are other people that I meet and think, oh, killing at that, killing on the road at this room with their filthy act.
Right.
That's their greatest joy.
Yeah.
Even though their act is embarrassing or whatever it is.
Right. Right.
So I love Vonnegut. I love Mark Twain. There's a woman, Jhumpa Lahiri, who writes these short stories. And I guess the story is she won the Pulitzer at such a young age, and she was living in Cambridge in this basement apartment, just typing away, whatever. And supposedly the old people who lived in the house, who owned the house, were like, what? The little girl from downstairs won the Pulitzer.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought was such a cool story,
Mhm. That's great.
Yeah.
So then you do the TBS show.
Mhm.
And then that ends, and you're writing for Ellen now?
Yeah, so I was really kind of fortunate where so many things that have happened in my life, I stumbled onto them by kind of sheer luck,
Mhm.
in the sense, early on I decided, you know what, I want to be on Johnny Carson, so I'm going to write clean, and that's what I'm going to do. And so what happened was, in Boston, when Brian Regan or Rita Rudner or Jerry Seinfeld or someone like that would come into town and they'd want someone clean to open for them, I was the person that they called. Not the club would be like, all right, we'll get Kiley because it's his person or whatever. So I ended up sort of carving a niche for myself.
Mhm.
And then what happened is, even headliners who work dirty, like a Robert Schimmel or something, he'd want me to open for him. And Steve Sweeney and some of the acts in Boston, because if this way, when they said fuck and the crowd hasn't heard that all night, they would explode.
Mhm.
Whereas if I had said it 20 times, it would have sort of
Right.
lessened the impact. So I ended up just sort of being the go-to clean opener for different people. And then, I was just, the other comics, we were just friends. We'd play softball, we'd hang out together, you'd do a show, and then you'd meet at a club afterwards and have a beer or whatever. And what I didn't realize was I was networking, because it turns out, So that's when I got my job at Conan. I was friends with Tom Agnew, I was friends with Chuck Sklar and Louis C.K., and so they recommended me. And then when the Conan show ended, the TBS show ended, I was just back to doing stand-up. And I hadn't done it full time in so long. It was like, oh my God, this is hard. There's you're driving 6 hours for a show, and the show's fine, but then you got to drive 6 hours back home.
Right. Yeah.
And the travel and all that stuff, and you have to constantly be on the phone booking gigs, and it was like, oh my God, I forgot how hard this was. And what happened with Ellen was somebody had worked at Conan and got a job at Ellen for many years. And I asked him, I said, are they looking for anybody? He goes, yeah, I left. They're looking to replace me. So this guy, Adam Yenser, said, yeah, you should apply, because I left. So one of the head writers, this guy named Gil Reef, I had done his kids' annual fundraiser at their synagogue every year or whatever. So so I had met him just from, they had a fundraiser and they needed somebody to work clean, and I'd go and I'd do the show. And so that's how I knew him. So when I reached out to him, he was like, yeah, why don't you submit a packet? And he kind of helped me looking it over, saying she wouldn't do something like this, but she'd like more of that, and figuring out what to write for her. But then they liked my packet and said, yeah, okay. So I was lucky to get a job after being out of work for 6 weeks or whatever.
Yeah.
But now Ellen's ending. So now I don't know what if you get a talk show or a sitcom or something, let me know.
All right, I'll keep you in mind. What are the main differences between writing for Conan, a late night show, and then writing for Ellen, which is a daytime?
That's a good question. Here's the thing. It's a late night, like Conan, the stuff had to really be hard hitting. And the stuff I write for Ellen, they laugh and go, we can't do that. And that happens every day. Even some things I think, oh, that seems so innocuous. And they're like, it's a daytime. And you're like, so it's definitely, it's just, I think I have a tendency to be too dark for them or whatever. So I have to kind of dial that down and try to make it more gentle. You have to be aware. It's like, there's kids watching. It's not a late night show. And
right. Yeah. So I know Conan is supposed to do an HBO Max show. Is that something you would go back to, or? Sure.
Absolutely. I love Conan. Conan's the funniest guy I know.
Right.
And what really amazed me about Conan was, I'd been around so many funny comics and quick-witted guys and people that, like Paula Poundstone and Don Gavin, some people are so fast. And Conan is, not only is he very fast, but he can create things that's just a 5-minute thing that's funny all the way through, that you go, okay, wait a minute. You just sort of ad-lib this funny scenario for 5 minutes that was funny the entire time. I'd never seen anything like that. He's a brilliant guy, and just the way he's able to create things off the cuff, I was like, okay, I've never seen anything like it. So I have to say, the Conan writers, like, I love being in a writer's room. I love being in the writer's room at Ellen. It's really fun. And the Conan writer's room was so funny every day. I would laugh my ass off every day. And I think that's one of the things I love about stand-up, is just hanging out with funny people.
Right. Yeah, it's the best.
I love going to work at Ellen and laughing in the writer's room. I love being in the green room with other comics. And, even in the old days when you drive to a show with a bunch of comics, you're all in the car driving to Stockbridge or New Hampshire or whatever. I love that stuff,
Yeah. You were roommates with Todd Barry, right?
I was, yeah. For a little while. And, you know, I had just started working at Conan, and I didn't have a place to live. So I stayed with Todd, and, you know, he talked about this on his Marin podcast, which I was embarrassed about. So in my room, I just had a bed, and that was it. You know, I had my clothes, and I had a bed, and so at night I would go in the bathroom. I didn't even have a light. I just had, you know, the light from the ceiling. But in terms of reading, I would go in the bathroom and I would put the toilet seat down, and that was the only good light.
Yeah.
And I would sit there and read. And sometimes he would come, and a lot of times I was just there by myself. He was out, you know, doing shows every night, and, you know,
Right.
whatever. But, you know, sometimes at 11 o'clock, he'd knock on the door because I'd get out so he could go to the bathroom or whatever. And he was making fun of me on Mark Maron, where he's like, you know, Kylie's in there reading Voltaire, and I've got to take a seat. And it's like, okay, you're telling 500,000 people that. But yeah, he, you know, Todd is a hilarious guy, but also, you know, every night he's doing multiple shows, and I think people don't realize that the dedication it takes to be a great stand-up, where, you know, people like Todd and the late Greg Giraldo and Jim Gaffigan, and they're Laurie Kilmartin, those people, they're just doing multiple shows every night, and that's why they're so good, you know?
Yeah, I agree. Is writing for a sitcom something you would ever be interested in?
Yes, I would love to do that. And I have to say, I love sitcom. I mean, I'll still watch an I Love Lucy or a Dick Van Dyke Show, or, you know, and I love what they do in the shadows. Is that what they call it?
Yeah.
You know, there's always sitcoms I love. And what I'm envious about sitcom writers is writing a talk show. It's kind of like writing in a newspaper, where 6 months later or whatever, no one cares about that show that no one's going to watch that show that you did, you know?
Right.
Where I love an old sitcom, and I'd love to write something that somebody would look at 20 years from now, you know?
When you're writing like your books, did you find like telling the story comes easy to you, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a matter of being able to have the time to kind of put into it, and letting your imagination go. And also, you know, I belong to this group where I don't want to say this anything inappropriate or negative. It's these people that I wouldn't hang out with. It's just, you know what I mean? It's just this sort of group but you know, it's you know, some of them are like 70-year-old women and whatever. It's like, well, I'm not gonna, you know, whatever. But those are the people that read novels, and they give great critique, and I can tell when I'm losing them and when they're with me, and they give great feedback. And yeah, it's very time consuming. But
how long does it take from start to finish with rewrites, and or does it vary?
The one I'm working on now, I'm you know, I haven't been doing it every day, so this is going to take a couple of, you know, probably 4 years or something. Rory, because I had that time off, took probably 8 months or 9 months. But yeah, it takes a year or two, you know, and also, no, you know, no one cares. No one reads books.
Right. Yeah.
It's for yourself or whatever. But the funny thing is, I have had people, I've got pitch meetings where people read it and contacted me and said, yeah, I would like to, you know, maybe make this an independent film or something. And I'm like, what? You know, yeah, I'd love to do that. And then, of course, nothing ever works out. But the fact that people were interested and set up meetings with me because of it, and whatever, it has helped me in that regard.
Right. Yeah, that's great. We'll wrap up with this. What's like the best piece of advice you would give to a comic that's just starting out?
Well, it's funny. My friend Laurie Kilmartin always says, do it every night for 10 years and you'll look good. And nobody wants to hear that. Everybody wants to be famous in 6 months and whatever. But I think that is great advice. I think really putting your 10,000 hours in, I think having a goal helps, because there are people that they just kill in clubs and then they never get out of the clubs. And then they go, oh, I don't want to do this the rest of my life. It's like, well, that's what you built, you know?
Right.
And to me, there are comics that are great at crowd work and crowds love it, but then they can only do more crowd work or whatever. To me, I kind of looked at that and go, okay, but those guys can't get on TV or they can't, no one's going to hire them to write. Well, maybe, you know, I shouldn't say that, but no one's seeing that their act in a way. You know what I mean? So I think figure out what you want to do and keep working towards that. And also, you have to be flexible. You know, sometimes somebody would come at Conan and it wouldn't work out because they'd want to do things their way. And it's like, well, it's his show and he wants it that way. So you'd have to kind of, even if you think, no, I'm right, he's wrong. Well, maybe so, but you have to do it his way in his show, you know? So I think being able to adapt and saying, okay, this isn't working, this is working, what, you know, I think just keep trying to get better. You know, I had somebody send me a movie script that they wrote 20 years ago. And I read it 20 years ago and I had some problems with it and I had some notes for them. And then they sent it back to me recently, the exact same script. And I wanted to go, what? You know, I wanted to go, yeah, my notes from 20 years ago were correct. I don't know why you didn't, you know? Yeah. And so he should have written 20 screenplays by this time, you know, or at least done 20 rewrites if this is the one thing that he's got, you know? So I think a lot of comics just don't work hard enough. You know, I saw somebody post a set right before COVID. It was the exact same set I saw him do when I was in college. I'm like, yeah, it's like, oh my God, you're still doing the same, you know? And so you think of it as a job, work at it every day, and just keep getting better. You know, if you put the time in, you and there's no reason that you can't be successful.
Right. Well, thanks so much for doing this, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Sure. I love talking comedy, so I'm happy to do it anytime.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Great talking to you. Okay. Bye.
Hey, baby, I hear the blues are calling. Tossed salads and scrambled eggs. Mercy. And maybe I seem a bit confused. Yeah, maybe. But I got you pegged. But I don't know what to do with those tossed salads and scrambled eggs. They're calling again. Scrambled eggs all over my face. What is a boy to do? Mabry has left the building.